And these are the co-authors that will work together on the project and their affiliations. Now the topic is modeling biomass elemental composition, a neurophysics approach. Now these are the motivation for the studies. This is the outline of my presentation. This is the outline of my presentation. Just a quick background. As mentioned by the previous presenter, the energy demand is increasing as the population is increasing, right? And you know, the excessive exploration of fossil fuel is actually threatening our climate. So something needs to be done. We've observed that we have alternative source in renewable energy, right? And one of those renewable energy which have been touted is biomass. Due to its availability and its global dispersion, we can make bold to say that we have bioresources almost everywhere in the world. There is no nation that is not endowed with bioresources, because it covers a whole lot of spectrum, including the municipal bioresources. So based on that, it was projected by World Bioenergy Association that by 2035, 5% of the agricultural area can be grown with dedicated energy crop, right? In an attempt to come up with biomass, bioresources feedstock that can be used in the bioenergy plant and for the production of co-products. When we are talking about these land surveys, moving across the world, you're going to observe that there are a lot of land surveys that has been a bit dormant, that have not been put to agricultural use. So that actually speaks to some of the critics that said that planting energy crop can cumber the ground and affect the food production. Most of this land have not been put to any food production use. Some of them have been abandoned, as it were, so they can be put to this use. So on that basis, it was projected that around 3,000 terawatt hour of electricity could be generated from bioresources by 2050. And looking at that, we are able to save up to 1.3 billion tons of CO2 emission equivalent per annum. Now, here comes the fourth industrial revolution. Looking at energy generation, it was suggested that digitalization of renewable energy industry could have significant effect on resource exploration, generation, and distribution, such that you were able to integrate fourth industrial 4.0 approach, right? We may be having the opportunity to optimize the valorization of biomass, so that we're able to produce greater number of energy products and co-products. And as the amount of data that is being generated increases, there is now more demand to explore the predictive models, which can actually use this high volume of data, helping the decision-making process. And bioenergy generation is not excluded, because it's going to bring more feasibility in the exploration, and in this support fast decision making in the industry. Now, among this machine learning technique and artificial intelligence tool, we talk about AMFIS, which is one of the models that has been developed and has been applied in several other spaces. Even this also have applied adaptive neurophysics inference system to develop some model due to its versatility and its ability to predict the characteristic of a variable as accurate as possible, right? So, but using AMFIS is not in itself sufficient, as we also need to understand the clustering technique that is most efficient or that give the optimal result. In that case, we from our research, we discovered that there has not been any study related to bioresources characterization or characterization of elemental composition, which has investigated the clustering technique. Yes, we have looked at development of model based on AMFIs, right? But the effect of clustering technique were not investigated. However, it is significant in data mining related to elemental composition. I mean, the most close-related study was by these authors, and what was done there was to compare AMFIs and hybrid AMFIs without any consideration for the effect of clustering technique on the performance of the model. Hence, the motivation for this study to look at the clustering technique. This become our method and materials. The data that was collected was from Guare et al. And 850 data points were actually used, randomized, and subsequently divided into 70-30 for training and testing, respectively. And we carry out some sort of statistical analysis to determine the minimum, maximum, and the standard deviation of the data set that we have. Vis-a-vis the fixed carbon content, volatile matter, ash content, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So this briefly about the data clustering technique. For this study, we apply PCC means, and we apply grid partitioning method, right? So talking about grid partitioning method, what's happening here is that it deployed a similar membership function to generate equal partition, such a way that the input space is divided so that each slice produces equal partition within the symmetric membership function, right? So the grid is constructed in a way that each portion of the grid is deployed to produce FUSI rule based on input-output training data. So that ensures that the learning rate is fast and calculation time is optimized in terms of performance, and you're able to obtain final grid that perform better. So this is this gives us some sort of schematics of our approach to this study. We use AMFIs, and this is the layer that is generally associated with AMFIs. That's called first layer, second layer, third layer, fourth layer, and fifth layer. And this is the clustering technique. For our input, we have fixed carbon, volatile matter, and ash. And on that basis, we predicted carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Now, the understanding here is that the proximate property of a material or a biomaterial dependent on the elemental composition. And among the elemental composition, the major one that bear impact on the fuel property and indeed the energetic property is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Hence, this model. For this case, now we use grid partitioning method and FUSI means. So these are the model performance metrics that we use: root mean square, mean absolute deviation, mean absolute percentage error, coefficient of correlation, log of accuracy ratio, variable accounted for. Now we use an hybrid or a combination of performance metrics in order to come up with more robust conclusion about the performance of the model. So from our study, we're able to come up with conclusion. The plot that we use here is what we call residual plot. In order for us to be able to compare the predicted and the actual for each and every clustering technique. So for carbon, we plotted the residual plot. The observation we have from the prediction for carbon based on the grid partitioning approach and FC and FCC means, we observe that for all the case study, most of the data points they cluster around the center line, which give us the impression that the prediction was relatively okay, as most of them they cluster around the center line. However, as some sort of difference, and in coming up with more informed conclusion, we observe for carbon that grid partitioning method have more number of data points that are far away from the center line. So for the prediction of carbon, we can come to conclusion that FCC means predicted better based on the number of data points that cluster around the center. And of course, we did this for testing and training stage of model development. Now, looking at oxygen, we have a similar trend, such that FCC means cluster more around the center compared to grid partitioning. And for the case of hydrogen, now there was something that is different that we observe here. When we look at the prediction, we observe that the highest spike that we obtained as a deviation from the center line was also obtained for grid partitioning. Again, for this case, we observe that most of the data point predicted based on FCC means they cluster around the center. Now, I'm more interested in training, but as you can see from our testing, we have a good result, as most of the data points they cluster around the center for the training, right? So in order to investigate further, we look at the performance criteria that I've mentioned previously, vis-a-vis their value for carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And these values were obtained. Looking at FCC means, we observe that it has the lowest root mean square error for carbon. For hydrogen, there was a bit different. And when we get to the case of oxygen, we observe that FCC means give higher root mean square error for oxygen. And we look at the pattern for other criteria. Of most interest is this value for carbon, which is mean absolute percentage error. So we can see that for carbon we have 5.0, which bettered what we have for grid partitioning, right? However, this also changed for hydrogen and oxygen. But by and large, when we look at the log accuracy ratio, we discover that the log accuracy ratio for FCC means bettered what we have for grid partitioning for all the cases. So in that case, it's supposed a better performance than grid partitioning in terms of testing, right? And when we look at training, we can look at the trend that we have there. We probe further to look at the computational time, knowing fully well that the computational time determines the cost efficiency of a model that is developed. So we are not only looking at the performance of the model, we're looking at the efficiency and the cost efficiency at which this model actually was developed. So from there, we observed that the computational time for FCC means was far lower compared to what was obtained for grid partitioning, right? So from there, we are able to come to some conclusion. Of course, we have said it ab initio that the elemental composition of biomass is vital. The prediction is vital to the bioenergy exploration, right? And we use two clustering techniques, like we have mentioned. The highest root mean square error was recorded for GP, and it occurred with carbon at a value of 6.09. Right, while the highest value of root mean square for FCC means occur with oxygen at a value of 4.381. when you compare it, the highest value that we have for the each and every of this model, we see observed that VCC means give us lower value compared to GP. And again, we observed that the high computational time was attributed to GP, almost times like times 5 of what we obtain. I mean, like times 10 of what we obtain for VCC means, right? So we see that VCC means perform better when we look at the overall indices that were evaluated, and we could come to a conclusion that given the data property, bearing any change in data attribute, right, and bearing any noise in the data and some other pre-processing properties which can affect the performance of the model, the application of VCC means as a clustering technique can be beneficial for this particular case study for the prediction of the elemental composition of biomass. So that is what we look at, and the further study we'll be looking forward to the area of application of these resources in the development of gas plant. Essentially, we're looking at updraft gasifier as a way to upscale this study, looking at how the predictive model will perform in those cases in actual prediction of power output. Thank you.
Thank you, Obafemi, for your interesting presentation. Are there any questions from the audience?